Welcome back to the studio. You're watching Eye on Africa here on France 24. I'm Shona Bhattacharya. Thanks so much for tuning in. Here are our top stories in this edition. Kenya deports the spokesperson for South Sudan's rebel leader Riek Machar. The move angered rights groups who say he was a refugee. It's the latest episode in a growing row over Kenya's peacekeeping role in the world's youngest country. Calling for restraint in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the UN urges both the government and the opposition to act in the good of the country a day before a banned opposition rally. And our special guest tonight is Nigerian fashion designer Alphadi, known as the Prince of the Desert. We'll be asking him about his sources of inspiration and the growing prominence of African fashion. A South Sudanese spokesperson for rebel Riek Machar has been deported from Kenya. James Gatek Dak was sent back to South Sudan, where relatives say he was arrested upon arrival in Juba, the capital. Kenyan authorities were angered after Dak wrote a Facebook post praising the firing of the Kenyan commander of UN peacekeeping operations in South Sudan. In reaction to his firing, Kenya announced it's pulling its 1,000 blue helmets from South Sudan and withdrawing from the peace process there. Our correspondent Julia Steers reported earlier on whether Kenya's move to deport James Gadet Dak was legal.
International human rights groups came out very strongly today against the move. They insist that it's a blatant breach of international law, namely because Gadet had been registered as a refugee here in Kenya since August 2015. So he can't be extradited back to his country, particularly if he's at risk of persecution or death. And it's widely agreed upon that he is at risk of both now that he is back in Juba and in the hands of the authorities. The UN's refugee agency here lobbied hard against deportation. They sent their lawyers to the airport to try to stop him from getting on the plane, but ultimately they were unable to prevent it. And they, along with Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, have all roundly condemned the deportation as illegal.
Urging restraint in the Democratic Republic of Congo, the United Nations called on both the government and the opposition to uphold the, quote, supreme interests of the country. This after the main dissident coalition, Rassemblement, or gathering, led by opposition leader Etienne Tshisekedi, called for a rally on Saturday despite a ban on unauthorized protests since September. Laurent Bersecker reports on the tensions that continue to grip the DRC.
Calling on their supporters to defy the ban, DRC's main opposition party, UDPS, said it would go through with planned demonstrations against President Joseph Kabila on Saturday. The UN warned of a potential upsurge in violence and called on all parties to show restraint. The government banned all forms of protests in the DRC after clashes in Kinshasa left dozens dead in September, a measure that's divided public opinion.
How long will they ban us from protesting? How long will they keep monitoring us? We are the people, and it's up to us to decide what we want to do.
A lot of people died, and it could happen again. That's not good for the country. So I don't think these protests should take place.
Longtime opponent Etienne Tshisekedi attended a funeral service Monday for 6 UDPS supporters who were killed in the September clashes. Addressing hundreds of mourners, senior party figures said they intended to keep fighting.
Remember, better to die standing up than to live on your knees.
Opposition supporters took to the streets in September to demand President Joseph Kabila step down at the end of his mandate. The protests were brutally repressed by security forces, leaving over 50 people dead. A United Nations report blamed the majority of casualties on police, saying they had shot, burnt, beat, and hacked dozens of civilians, as well as paid groups of thugs to attack protesters.
Liberia was hit by a massive cyber attack and internet is down. Hackers targeted the country's entire internet infrastructure using what's called a distributed denial of service, or DDoS. That's when a network of computers and other devices infected with a virus are all directed to a site to overload its servers. This cyber attack follows the same methods employed in a series of attacks against U.S. websites on October 21st. That was the biggest internet disruption to date. Fired for attacking the foundations of diplomacy. Tunisia's religious affairs minister was removed from his post this Friday after he suggested Saudi Arabia's Wahhabi form of Islam had links to terrorism. Comments Abdeljalil Ben Salem made to two senior Saudi officials and repeated in a parliament session. Prime Minister Youssef Chahed replaced Ben Salem with the country's justice minister. Burkina Faso is hosting the 14th International Crafts Exhibition through this weekend. 3,000 artisans from 25 countries are exposing their creations, and some 300,000 visitors are expected before the fair is over. Our correspondents took a closer look at Dan Fani fabric, a hand-woven cotton cloth with weaving styles and patterns that differ depending on the ethnic group making it. One Women's Association in Ouagadougou, the Burkina Faso capital, is perpetuating that tradition.
Everything here is handmade, starting with the fabric. Spun by hand, it's then stretched over a frame before ending up in this big loom.
I use my feet here to pedal. I use my hands to pull. We do it like this. Here, I pull like this to go forward. It goes through here and here.
The Faso Dan Fani, literally meaning hand-woven clothing, is a symbol of Burkinabe identity. It was popularized by Thomas Sankara in the 1980s, who made it a symbol of the revolution. Wearing Faso Dan Fani became a patriotic gesture.
This is a renowned material we call patheo. We call it patheo after the Ivorian designer who created it and has designed a lot of collections.
The Dan Fani fabric is one of the most popular materials at the Ouagadougou International Crafts Fair. But to get access, all visitors are searched at the entrance, a reminder that the January attacks earlier this year have changed the habits of the residents of Ouagadougou.
And our guest tonight is Alphadi, arguably Africa's most prominent fashion designer. Earlier this year, he was named a UNESCO Artist for Peace. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much
for joining us on Eye on Africa. Let's start by talking about your fashion festival that until last year was held in Niamey, the capital of Niger, your homeland. What is your vision for the future of this festival, and what pushed you to create it in the first place?
Thank you for your invitation. I'm so happy to be here with you. And really, we try to make through our design and our creativity. And I think Niger is like one of country in Africa or handcraft and textile supposed to be known, and everybody loves to be there. And my festival is really one of the biggest festivals in Africa to help designers and to help of younger to become grown and to give them chance to promote textile and to promote design. And in Africa, really, this festival gives chance to African designer for textile, also for jewelry to come and to show their collection every 2 years. That is very important for us.
So how do you see African fashion in the 21st century?
I think really now is our time. And everybody loves to wear African collection and African textile. And we really have this opportunity to give chance to give our textile to European. Now you see all the European designers use African textile. They use also African jewelry. That's very important for us. We're supposed to do it by ourselves. That's very important for us to grow. That's why we are going to build the big school in Niger, the University for Fashion and Arts. It's very important for me to build this school and to help African designers to become true, give them chance to become real nice, known designer.
How did you know that you wanted to be a fashion designer?
I don't know. That's my mother refused to give me chance to be. And that is the problem we have, because in my country, men can't do fashion. They can sew maybe, but they have big names that's very, very prohibited in my country to become fashion. They give me a chance. I am so happy to be a designer today, to help women and to help men for that. And for UNESCO, my hobby, my work is for peace, to design and to give sense, because it's very important to continue this kind of way.
And who are your biggest inspirations in your work?
I think Yves Saint Laurent, he's like a European big designer. I am inspired by him because Paco Rabanne also, they invited me all the time in Europe when I was very young, and I work with them, and they give me chance also to come to see the collection. And where I was student here in Paris and in New York, I worked with them, and all time we are together to see how they make design through. They help Africa, and also they use sometimes African textile, and they call me and they say, we can use it. I said, yes, it's very important for us to use a kind of textile for Africa and to give chance to use African designer also about that.
Can we talk about African fashion? Do you do African fashion, or do you say that you do your fashion?
I do African fashion, and my fashion is like to use like the mixed African textile, to mix African jewelries, to mix African models also. That's me. And I think really African fashion is also for the industrial now to give chance fashion become true, because in Africa we don't wanna talk about only wear, on the sad, on the sickness. We talk about fashion. Give Africa chance really to become true. And also, we need financial person. We need bankies. We need the government, the politician to help fashion designer to get money and to make employment. I think poverty is really real reality in Africa. And this kind of job like fashion can help really to reduce this poverty. This is why we make my force to help the designer to really to give chance to make design for that.
Thank you so much for being our guest today.
Thank you so much.
Eye on Africa.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
And that's the end of this edition of Eye on Africa, but do stay tuned. There's more news coming up on France 24. Stay with us.
France 24, history in the making.